Dr. Simone Hayes considered the house her magnum opus, more than the medical degree from Johns Hopkins, more than her fellowship in cardiothoracic surgery. This two-story modern craftsman in Atlanta's rapidly gentrifying Buckhead neighborhood was the physical proof of her arrival. It was a statement written in steel, glass, and reclaimed timber. From the curb, it was an architectural marvel. Inside, it was a technological fortress. Everything is linked to the proprietary app, the slick 20-something developer had explained during the final walkthrough. Lights, locks, climate, sound system, security. You can preheat your oven from the OR. Your house will know you're 5 minutes away and draw you a bath. It's not a smart home, it's an intuitive one. Simone, a woman whose life was a testament to precision and control, found the concept intoxicating. At 32, she had curated her existence with the same meticulous care she applied to a triple bypass. Her career was demanding, her social life was a well-managed portfolio of meaningful connections, and her home was to be her sanctuary, a place where the chaos of the emergency room could not breach the walls. The first week was a symphony of digital convenience. The house would wake her with a slow, simulated sunrise and the scent of brewing coffee. As she left for the hospital, a single tap on her phone would lock the doors, arm the alarms, and lower the blinds. She moved through her new life with the seamless efficiency she'd always craved. A black woman who had not just earned a seat at the table, but had built her own damn table from scratch. The first dissonant note was subtle, easily dismissed. A delivery driver, a white man in his 50s with a sun-beaten face, stood on her porch holding a large box containing a Peloton bike. He looked from the address on the box to Simone, then back again. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face. "Dr. Simone Hayes?" he asked, the title sounding foreign on his tongue. "That's me," she said, her voice even. "You the new owner?" "I am," she replied, the unspoken questions hanging in the humid Georgia air. You can afford this?" She'd heard it all before, the soft-pedaled surprise that someone like her could occupy a space like this. She signed for the package and closed the solid oak door, the weight of his gaze feeling heavier than the bike itself. She spent the evening assembling the machine, losing herself in the satisfying click of bolts and the clean smell of new rubber. Exhausted, she finally retreated to her master suite, the city lights of Atlanta twinkling through her floor-to-ceiling windows. "Hey, Nexus," she said to the small, glowing orb on her nightstand. "Play calming jazz and dim lights to 20%. The house obeyed instantly. The smooth tones of Miles Davis filled the room as the lights softened to a warm, amber glow. She slipped into bed, the crisp, high thread count sheets cool against her skin. For the first time in a long time, she felt a profound sense of peace. This was her space, safe, secure, controlled. She drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind surgeons rarely get. It was the music that woke her, not the jazz, which had long since faded into programmed silence. This was different. It was a melody from a place she hadn't visited in decades, a soft, ethereal humming that filled the cavernous bedroom, a lullaby. Her mother's lullaby, the one she used to sing to Simone when she was a child, sick with a fever. A tune she hadn't heard since her mother passed away 15 years ago. Simone's eyes snapped open. The room was pitch black, the Nexus orb dark. Her heart, the organ she knew so intimately, began to hammer against her ribs. The lullaby wasn't coming from the speaker. It was coming from all the speakers, a ghostly multi-room whisper that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling with the screen. The home app showed the sound system was offline. All systems were offline. Yet the humming continued, a deeply personal, impossibly intimate sound in the sterile darkness. It knew her. It knew a secret piece of her soul that wasn't stored on any cloud, shared on any social media, or written in any file. She sat bolt upright in bed, clutching the sheets, every surgical nerve ending screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The house was no longer a sanctuary. It was a witness, and it had just shared a secret it had no right to know. The lullaby played on for another 30 seconds, then faded into a silence more terrifying than the sound itself. Simone didn't sleep for the rest of the night, listening to the quiet hum of a house that had suddenly become a stranger. In the sterile light of morning, paranoia felt like a luxury Simone couldn't afford. Surgeons operate on facts, on data, on observable phenomena. A phantom lullaby did not fit into that worldview. It was a glitch, she told herself, the words a mantra as she ran a diagnostic on the Nexus home system. Results. All systems operating normally. She rebooted the entire network, the digital equivalent of a cleansing breath. It had to be a technical fluke, a random audio file corrupted in the system's initial setup. It had to be. But the house kept whispering. The glitches, as she forced herself to call them, grew more frequent, more specific. One night, she woke up shivering, the air in her bedroom arctic. The smart thermostat, which she meticulously kept at a comfortable 72 degrees, now read 58. The app on her phone showed no record of the change. It was as if the house itself had decided she needed to be cold. A few days later, she was settling onto the couch after a grueling 14-hour shift, ready to lose herself in a mindless reality show. As she reached for the remote, the 85-inch screen flickered to life on its own. It wasn't Netflix or HBO. It was a local news channel, mid-broadcast on a special report. Atlanta's missing, a pattern of vanishings, haunts the metro area. The anchor's face was grim as she detailed the cases of 3 women who had disappeared from their homes without a trace. The television's volume slowly increased, filling the cavernous living room with a sense of dread that was too deliberate to be a malfunction. The final straw was the front door. She was leaving for a charity gala, dressed in a stunning black gown, when the digital lock on her front door beeped erratically. Access denied, the small screen flashed. She tried her phone app. Error 301, lock unresponsive. She tried her physical key card. Nothing. For 10 terrifying minutes, she was a prisoner in her own home. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the lock chirped a pleasant tone and disengaged. The system log showed no error, no event, no record of her being trapped. Simone called OmniLife, the company that had installed the system. The technician on the phone was patient but unhelpful, guiding her through the same diagnostics she'd already run a dozen times. "Ma'am, I'm looking at your system's remote data right now," he said, his voice laced with the bored certainty of someone who deals with user error all day. "There are no faults, no breaches, no unscheduled events. Everything is green across the board. Are you sure you're using the app correctly?" The condescension in his tone ignited a spark of anger. "I am a cardiothoracic surgeon," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I can restart a human heart. I assure you, I can operate a phone app." The silence on the other end was telling. Feeling a creeping sense of vulnerability she hadn't experienced since her first day as an intern, she did something she never thought she'd do. She filed a report with the Atlanta Police Department. She didn't mention the lullabies or the TV. She kept it to the facts, a recurring feeling of being watched and potential security system tampering. The officer who responded was a man named Miller. He was white, with a thick mustache and a weary posture that suggested he'd seen it all and was impressed by none of it. He stood in her gleaming minimalist foyer, his scuffed boots looking obscene on the polished concrete floors. He took in the high ceilings, the expensive art on the walls, and Simone herself. "So, you think someone is, hacking your thermostat?" he asked, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "I think someone might have unauthorized access to my home's network," Simone corrected him, keeping her tone professional. "It's a comprehensive system. If they're in the network, they're in my house." Miller scribbled something in his notepad. "Any signs of forced entry? Anything stolen?" "No, that's the point. It's digital." "Right, digital." He looked around again, his gaze lingering on a family photo of Simone with her parents. "Listen, doctor," he said, his voice softening into a placating drawl she recognized instantly, the kind of tone used on hysterical women. "You've got a high-stress job, a big new house. You live alone. Sometimes the mind can play tricks on you. You get tired, you forget you turned the AC down." The implication was clear. She wasn't a reliable narrator of her own experience. She was just another overworked, lonely, professional woman imagining things. He saw her race, her gender, her success, and filtered her fear through a lens of the tired stereotypes. "I'm not imagining it, officer," she said, her jaw tight. Okay. He held up his hands in mock surrender. "We'll file a report. Probably not much we can do without any actual evidence. You know, a broken window or something. You just try to get some rest, ma'am." He left, and Simone locked the door behind him, the same lock that had held her captive days before. The feeling of being dismissed, of her valid fears being written off as female hysteria, was suffocating. She was alone, not just in the house, but in her reality. The world outside saw a successful black woman in a mansion and assumed she was safe, or perhaps just paranoid. But inside, the walls were closing in, and the whispers from the network were getting louder. "The police think I'm crazy." Simone's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, as she relayed the encounter with Officer Miller to her best friend Maya over coffee. Maya, a sharp-witted corporate lawyer who had been Simone's rock since college, frowned into her latte. "Of course they do," Maya said, her tone laced with a familiar cynicism. "To them, you're a unicorn, a black woman living alone in a house that costs more than their entire precinct's annual budget. They don't see a victim, they see a headline they don't understand, so they dismiss it." She leaned forward, her expression turning serious. "Forget them? We handle this ourselves. The system is compromised? Fine. We go analog." Maya's logic was a lifeline in Simone's sea of anxiety. "What do you mean?" "I mean we build our own surveillance, independent of the house's network. A few simple Wi-Fi cameras, Wise, Arlo, something cheap and easy. They connect directly to your phone, on a separate network if we have to. If someone's in there, we'll see them." That afternoon, they went to Best Buy and returned with a shopping bag full of small white security cameras. They spent hours placing them strategically. One in the living room with a clear view of the front and back doors, one in the kitchen, and one in the upstairs hallway overlooking her bedroom entrance. They set them to record on motion detection, a simple, foolproof system completely divorced from the compromised Nexus network. For the first time in weeks, a sliver of control returned to Simone. She had her own eyes now, but the ghost in her house was smarter. The strange occurrences continued, but they were now maddeningly subtle, always happening just outside the camera's fields of vision. A book she was reading, left on the kitchen island, in full view of the camera, would be found on her nightstand the next morning, with no motion detected on the recordings. The milk she'd just bought would be a little bit lighter, the orange juice level a fraction of an inch lower. It was the work of a phantom who understood the geometry of surveillance, who knew how to live in the margins, in the blind spots. Simone became obsessed, spending hours scrubbing through footage, searching for a flicker of movement, a shadow that didn't belong. She found nothing. The house on the recordings was pristine, empty, silent. Yet the feeling of being watched had intensified, evolving from a vague unease into a suffocating certainty. It felt like a presence was breathing down her neck, always just out of sight. The violation reached its terrifying apex on a Tuesday night. After a particularly brutal shift where she'd lost a patient on the table, Simone needed to wash the day away. She turned the shower in her master bathroom on full blast, the water scalding hot, hoping the steam would cleanse not just her skin, but her frayed nerves. The bathroom was her inner sanctum, a spa-like retreat with heated floors and a rainfall shower head. It was the one room she hadn't put a camera in. It felt too private, too sacred. She stepped into the glass enclosure, letting the water cascade over her head, and closed her eyes. The steam filled the room, fogging the mirrors and glass, cocooning her in a warm, white cloud. She reached for the shampoo, her muscles slowly unknotting under the torrent of water. Suddenly, the lights went out. The entire bathroom was plunged into an abrupt, disorienting darkness. The sudden sensory deprivation made the sound of the rushing water deafening. Her heart leaped into her throat. A power outage? But the water was still hot, meaning the water heater was still working. "Nexus, lights on," she called out, her voice trembling. Silence. "Nexus, bathroom lights at 100%. Nothing. The system was dead. She stood frozen in the rushing water, her eyes straining to pierce the inky blackness. And then she heard it. It wasn't a loud noise. It was almost nothing. A sound so quiet, so faint. She would have missed it if her every sense hadn't been on high alert. Over the roar of the shower, from the direction of the ceiling, came a tiny, mechanical click. It was the unmistakable sound of a camera shutter. It came from the small metal grate of the air conditioning vent, directly above the shower, an eye in the ceiling. An unseen observer, hidden in the very architecture of her sanctuary, capturing her at her most vulnerable. A scream lodged in her throat, silent and sharp. She fumbled for the shower handle, turning off the water. The sudden silence was even more terrifying. She was trapped in the dark with it, with him. Her privacy hadn't just been breached, it had been stolen, cataloged, and stored by an invisible predator who lived in the bones of her own home. She backed into the far corner of the shower, wrapping her arms around herself, cold and exposed, listening to the drip, drip, drip of water in the suffocating, watchful dark. The incident in the shower marked a turning point. The ghost was no longer content to be a passive observer. It had begun to interact, to play. Caleb Mitchell, the unseen architect of her terror, shifted his tactics from technological harassment to a deeply personal form of psychological warfare. His goal was no longer just to watch, but to make Simone question the very fabric of her reality. He wanted to unmoor her, to isolate her in a prison of her own mind, until he was the only thing left that felt real. The gaslighting began with the small things, the intimate details of her life. One morning, she walked into her living room and found the silver frame photograph of her late mother, which always sat on the mantel, turned face down. A jolt of ice shot through her veins. It was a subtle act of desecration, a violation of memory. When she checked the camera footage, she saw nothing. The angle was perfect. The mantel was a sliver of a blind spot between the camera's wide-angle lens and the fireplace. He knew. He knew exactly where to stand. Then came the food. It wasn't just that items were slightly used. They began to change. She bought a specific brand of artisanal goat cheese for a dinner party, only to find it replaced in the refrigerator with a cheap generic cheddar, the packaging almost identical. She'd grab her favorite Greek yogurt for breakfast, and it would taste faintly, almost imperceptibly, sour, as if it had been left out for a few minutes and then put back. These were not mistakes she would make. She was meticulous, organized. Yet the evidence in her home suggested she was becoming forgetful, careless, erratic. She started taking pictures of her refrigerator before she left for work, a desperate attempt to prove to herself that she wasn't losing her mind. Her isolation was compounded by the arrival of a new neighbor. Brenda, a woman in her late 40s with a perfectly coiffed blonde bob and an air of aggressive friendliness, moved into the house next door. She introduced herself one afternoon, while Simone was watering her hydrangeas, her gaze sweeping over Simone's property with an unnerving intensity. "It's just wonderful to see some new life in the neighborhood," Brenda said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Though, you must have a very active social life. I see people coming and going at all hours." Simone froze, the watering can hovering over a bloom. "I'm sorry?" "Oh, you know," Brenda continued, waving a dismissive hand. "Visitors. Deliveries, I suppose. There was a man leaving your driveway very early yesterday morning. I was just getting my paper. I thought it was a bit odd." Simone hadn't had any visitors. She hadn't ordered anything. Her blood ran cold. Was Caleb now brazen enough to be seen? Or was this another one of his games, whispering poison into her neighbor's ear to paint her as unstable, reckless? "I think you must be mistaken," Simone said, her voice tight. Brenda's smile tightened as well. "Perhaps. Well, welcome to the neighborhood, dear. Do let me know if you need anything at all." The offer felt less like a kindness and more like a warning. The pressure was becoming immense. At the hospital, her legendary focus began to fray. Her hands, which could steady a beating heart, now trembled as she sipped her coffee. Colleagues noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the way she would flinch at unexpected noises. "Simone, are you okay?" Dr. Eris Thorne, the head of her department, asked one day, pulling her aside. "Your sutures on the last bypass were less precise than usual. Is everything all right at home?" How could she possibly explain? "I think a ghost lives in my walls and is trying to drive me insane by moving my mother's picture and swapping out my cheese." They already saw her as an anomaly, a black woman excelling in a field dominated by white men. Admitting to this kind of vulnerability felt like professional suicide. They would see it as a weakness, a crack in the pristine facade. "I'm fine, Eris," she lied, forcing a weary smile, "just not sleeping well. The new house is still making noises." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, by an enemy she couldn't see. He was in her food, her photos, her neighbors' perceptions, her own self-doubt. Caleb wasn't just haunting her house. He was colonizing her mind, leaving her stranded on an island of paranoia where no one could hear her scream, because, from the outside, it looked just like paradise. She would stand in the middle of her beautiful, cavernous living room, a space that was supposed to represent her success, and feel like the loneliest, most terrified person on earth. The house was no longer a home. It was a stage for a play where she was the only actor, and the audience was a single, malevolent eye. The breaking point came not with a whisper, but with a total, deafening silence. On a Friday evening, Simone's internet connection vanished. Not just the Wi-Fi, the entire hardline connection to the house was dead. Her smart home, her fortress of intuition, was suddenly rendered mute and stupid. The lights were stuck at their last setting, the thermostat was frozen, and her security cameras were useless, blinking with pathetic orange lights of disconnection. She was technologically blind. Her first call was to OmniLife, the company whose system was now a multi-$100,000 pile of bricks. After an infuriating hour on hold, they scheduled a technician for the following morning. "We're very busy, ma'am," the dispatcher said curtly. "It's the best we can do." The next morning, a different kind of technician arrived. He wasn't a fresh-faced kid following a script. He was an older man named Frank, with graying hair and hands that looked like they knew their way around a circuit board. He didn't patronize her. He just grunted, opened a panel in the utility closet, and got to work. For 2 hours, Frank muttered to himself, tracing wires and running diagnostics on his ruggedized laptop. Simone hovered nearby, a bundle of nerves. Finally, he leaned back on his heels and let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, looking at Simone with a newfound respect. "You were right. Somebody's been in here." The validation was so powerful, Simone felt her knees go weak. "What did you find?" "It's not what I found. It's what I almost didn't find," Frank explained, pointing to a tangle of wires. "See this Ethernet splitter here? It's not on the schematics. Someone physically spliced this in. It creates think of it as a secret door, a network backdoor. It gives someone full root-level access to your entire system, but it's completely invisible to remote diagnostics. They can see everything, control everything, and cover their tracks perfectly. It's brilliant, actually. Scary brilliant." He looked at the meticulous, almost artistic way the wires were crimped and organized. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He squinted, leaning closer. "This is clean work. Damn clean. Reminds me of a guy who used to work for OmniLife's custom installations division. Name was Caleb Mitchell." Simone's heart stopped. She could barely breathe. "Caleb Mitchell?" "Yeah, the kid was a certified genius, a prodigy with network architecture. But weird," Frank said, shaking his head. "Real quiet, intense. Had this way of looking at you that made your skin crawl. OmniLife fired him about a year ago. There were complaints." "What kind of complaints?" Simone asked, her voice a strained whisper. Frank hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He got obsessed with a female project manager, started tracking her company car through the GPS, sending her weirdly personal emails about conversations he'd overheard. Nothing explicitly threatening, just creepy. Crossed a line. They let him go quietly to avoid a lawsuit. For the first time, the formless, shapeless terror that had been tormenting her for months had a name. Caleb Mitchell. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a glitch. He was a man who had designed her home's nervous system, a man who had stood in these rooms, run wires through these walls, and built himself a secret door to her life. Her mind raced back to the installation day. She vaguely remembered a quiet, lanky young man who barely made eye contact, but worked with a focused, almost reverent intensity. She had offered him a coffee, made small talk about his work, a simple, throwaway gesture of kindness. To her, it was nothing. To him, it was apparently an invitation. "This guy, Caleb," Simone said, her voice shaking. "Do you know where he is now?" "Nah, no idea," Frank said, already packing up his tools. "Probably some tech startup making a fortune. A guy with his skills always lands on his feet." He handed her an invoice. I've removed the back door and secured your network. Reset all your passwords. You should be safe now. But Simone knew she wasn't safe. Frank had closed the digital door, but Caleb wasn't just a hacker. He was an obsession made manifest. He had been inside her network, and the chilling realization began to dawn on her that the network might not have been the only thing he'd breached. The lullaby, the click in the bathroom, the moved objects. That wasn't a hacker sitting behind a keyboard miles away. That was someone who was close. Terrifyingly close. The ghost had a name, and now Simone was more afraid than ever. The knowledge of Caleb's identity did not bring relief, only a sharper, more focused terror. The enemy was no longer an abstract entity. He was a man with a name, a face she could vaguely recall, and a documented history of obsession. With Frank's intervention, the house fell silent. The thermostat held steady, the TV remained off, and the locks obeyed her commands. But this new quiet was not peaceful. It was the unnerving stillness of a predator holding its breath. Simone moved through the now secured house like a ghost herself, triple-checking the newly installed deadbolts and drawing the blinds the moment dusk fell. She ate standing up in the kitchen, unable to relax, her ears straining to catch any sound that was out of place. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. 2 nights after Frank's visit, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from an unknown number. Her blood turned to ice. She knew with sickening certainty who it was from. With a trembling hand, she reached for the phone. The message contained only a single sentence. "That blue silk nightgown looks beautiful on you." She was wearing it. A new one she'd bought that very afternoon. A small act of self-care in an attempt to reclaim some normalcy. No one had seen it. It hadn't been posted online. The only way he could know was if he was looking at her. Right now. A primal scream built in her chest, but she choked it down. Noise was a weakness. Noise would tell him he'd succeeded in terrifying her. Her eyes darted around the darkened room, searching for the source of the violation. The window? The curtains were drawn. The air vent? She had taped it over. Where was he looking from? Her mind snapped to the Wise cameras, her own independent eyes. She grabbed her tablet from the nightstand, her fingers slipping on the screen as she launched the app. She swiped to the upstairs hallway camera, the one pointed directly at her bedroom door. The feed was grainy in the low light, but it was clear enough. The hallway was empty. She was about to swipe away to dismiss it, when a flicker of movement at the edge of the frame caught her eye. She rewound the motion-activated clip by 5 seconds and played it again, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. There, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of a doorway down the hall. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a human form, tall and slender, moving with a liquid grace that spoke of familiarity. It slid along the wall, out of the camera's main line of sight, toward her room. He wasn't outside. He was in the hallway. This time, she screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure terror. She scrambled out of bed, fumbling for her phone, and dialed 911. Her voice was a ragged, hysterical sob as she spoke to the dispatcher. "There's someone in my house. He's in my house right now. Please, you have to send someone." "Ma'am, calm down. What is your address?" She gasped out the address, her eyes fixed on her locked bedroom door, expecting the handle to turn at any moment. She could hear the dispatcher relaying the information, the tinny sound of a radio in the background. "Police are on their way, ma'am. Can you stay on the line?" "He's here. I saw him on my camera." She sobbed, pushing her heaviest nightstand against the door, a futile barricade against the inevitable. The minutes stretched into an eternity. She could hear the distant wail of sirens growing closer, a beautiful, hopeful sound in the suffocating silence of the house. Then, the blessed sound of heavy knocking on the front door. "Atlanta PD, open up!" Simone waited, her breath held, until she heard them announce they were entering. Only then did she move the nightstand and crack open her door. Standing in her foyer, his hand on his hip and his expression a mask of profound annoyance, was Officer Miller. The same officer who had dismissed her concerns weeks ago. He was with a younger, silent partner. "Dr. Hayes," Miller said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Another digital ghost?" "I saw him," she insisted, showing him the tablet with the footage still paused. "Right there, in the hallway." Miller and his partner glanced at the screen. The image was dark and blurry. "Ma'am, that could be anything," Miller said with a sigh. "A shadow from a passing car's headlights." "It was a person. He texted me." She showed him the message about her nightgown. Miller looked at the text, then back at her. "It's an unknown number. Could be a wrong number, a sick prank. It's not proof of anything." Despite her protests, they conducted a search. It was cursory, dismissive. They swept through the rooms with their flashlights, opened a few closet doors, and declared the house clear in under 5 minutes. They didn't check the attic. They didn't look in the crawl space. They didn't look for anything that wasn't immediately obvious. "The house is secure, Doctor," Miller said, standing at the open front door, letting the cold night air in. "All windows and doors are locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry. Nobody's here." "But he was here," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "You have to believe me." "We're done here," Miller said, his patience gone. "Try not to waste any more city resources tonight." He and his partner walked out, leaving the front door ajar. Simone stood frozen in the entryway. The feeling of abandonment, a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. They had come. They had looked. And they had left her alone with the monster they refused to see. She watched their taillights disappear down the street, and the silence that descended upon the house felt final. It was the silence of a tomb. After the police cruisers vanished into the Atlanta night, a new kind of silence settled over the house on Peachtree. It was no longer the watchful silence of a predator. It was the dead, heavy silence of a sealed trap. Caleb Mitchell knew he had been seen. The call to the police, the flashing lights, the angry voices. It was all a violation of the perfect secret world he had built. She had tried to bring outsiders into their home. She had tried to have him cast out. He could not allow that. If he couldn't have her in secret, he would have her forever. For Simone, standing in the foyer left open by the departing officers, the world had shrunk to the dimensions of her house. The police, the final barrier between her and the terror, had failed. They had walked through her home and pronounced it safe, their blindness a death sentence. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee into the night and never look back. But where could she go? He was a ghost in the machine, a phantom with a key to her entire digital life. With a surge of adrenaline, she slammed the front door shut and engaged the heavy analog deadbolt she'd had installed. Her phone felt cold and useless in her hand. Who else could she call? Maya? What could she do? This was beyond a friend's help. As she stood there, her mind racing, she heard a soft thump from the utility closet down the hall. It was followed by a series of quiet, efficient clicks. The lights went out. This time, it wasn't just a single room. The entire house was plunged into absolute suffocating blackness. The ambient glow from her smart devices, the digital clocks, the standby lights on her appliances, all extinguished. He had cut the power at the main breaker. She fumbled for her phone, using its screen as a feeble flashlight. She tried to open the Nexus app to override the locks, to open the garage door, anything. Network unavailable. He had cut the connection too. The intuitive house was now a brick-and-mortar prison, its smart features turned against its owner, locking her in. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up her throat. She stumbled through the darkness toward the back door, her bare feet slapping against the cold, polished concrete. She reached the door, her hands searching for the deadbolt. As her fingers closed around the metal knob, she heard it. A soft creak from the hallway behind her. He was out. He was no longer content to live in the walls, in the shadows, in the digital ether. He was in the open now, in the dark, with her. The hunt was over. Simone didn't scream. The sound was trapped in her lungs, a knot of pure primal fear. She turned, her phone's light cutting a weak, trembling beam through the darkness, and saw him. A tall, thin silhouette standing at the end of the hall, perfectly still. He was just a shape, a void in the blackness, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. The phone slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor and extinguishing its light. The darkness was absolute. The sun rose the next morning on a scene of jarring domestic tranquility. The house on Peachtree stood silent and pristine, its modern lines sharp against the soft pinks of the dawn sky. A newspaper lay on the manicured lawn. Nothing looked out of place. It was Detective Isaiah Ramsey who saw the truth beneath the placid surface. He arrived at 6:30 a.m., his car pulling up behind the two patrol units that had established the perimeter. Ramsey was a man carved from the city itself, tall, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and eyes that had seen too much to be easily surprised. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace that belied the urgency of his profession. In his 15 years in homicide, he had learned that chaos had a pattern, and violence left a residue that no amount of cleaning could ever truly erase. He ducked under the yellow tape, his gaze sweeping over the house. No signs of forced entry, the primary officer reported, the same young, silent partner of Officer Miller from the night before. The friend Maya found her, had a spare key. Victim is in the living room. Ramsey entered the house, and the first thing that hit him was the smell. The coppery tang of blood mixed with the faint, cloying scent of lavender from an overturned aromatherapy diffuser. The second thing he noticed was the sheer violence of the scene. This was not a clean, professional hit. This was a frenzy. Dr. Simone Hayes lay on a white designer rug, now soaked a deep, horrific crimson. The living room was a whirlwind of destruction. An overturned glass coffee table, shattered picture frames, a thrown lamp, and in the middle of it all, her body told a story of a desperate final struggle. "She fought like hell," Ramsey murmured, circling the scene. The medical examiner, already at work, nodded in agreement. "Defensive wounds on her hands and arms. We've got skin and blood under her fingernails. She got a piece of him." Ramsey's eyes moved past the body, scanning the room, the architecture of the crime. Everything was broken, thrown, shattered, except for the doors and windows. They were pristine. The digital lock on the front door was unscratched. The windows were all locked from the inside. It didn't make sense. A home invasion this violent should have started with a shattered window or a splintered door frame. "Who was the responding officer last night?" Ramsey asked the young patrolman. Officer Miller, sir. And me. We cleared the house around 11 p.m. "Cleared it?" Ramsey's voice was low, dangerous. "You searched this house and found nothing?" "Yes, sir. It was empty." Ramsey looked back at the scene, at the violent explosion that had happened in a sealed container. He knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a man who spoke the language of violence, that the patrolman was wrong. They hadn't found nothing. They just hadn't known where to look. The monster hadn't broken into the castle. The monster was already inside. Detective Isaiah Ramsey stood in the middle of Simone Hayes' silent kitchen, the heart of a home that had become a tomb. The forensics team moved around him with practiced efficiency, their quiet work a stark contrast to the violence that had unfolded just a room away. Ramsey wasn't looking at the evidence bags or the fingerprint dust. He was looking at a small white magnetic board on the stainless steel refrigerator. It was covered in Simone's neat, cursive handwriting, grocery lists, appointment reminders, and a small, hopeful note to herself. "Call Maya, Ray vacation." It was these small, human details that always gnawed at him. The evidence of a life in progress, brutally and irrevocably stopped. This wasn't just a case file. It was the final unwritten chapter of a woman's story. And it was his job to write it. His partner brought him a thin folder. "The incident reports you asked for, Zay." Ramsey took the file and leaned against the cold granite countertop. He began to read, and with every page, a slow, cold anger began to build in his chest. First, there was Simone's initial report weeks ago. Feeling of being watched, security system tampering. It was logged and closed with no follow-up. Then, there was last night's 911 call. He read the transcript of Simone's frantic, terrified pleas. He saw the dispatcher's notes. And finally, he read Officer Miller's report from the scene. The words were a monument to dismissive arrogance. Complainant appears anxious and potentially paranoid. No evidence of intruder. Advise complainant to get rest. And the final damning line, possible 1096. A police code for a person with mental health issues. Ramsey closed the folder, his knuckles white. Miller hadn't seen a terrified woman begging for her life. He'd seen a hysterical black woman in a house he felt she didn't belong in, and he'd dismissed her. He had walked through a murder scene hours before it happened and had seen nothing but an inconvenience. That negligence hadn't just been unprofessional, it had been fatal. "The key isn't how he got in," Ramsey said, more to himself than to his partner. "It's how he stayed in." He walked back into the living room, his eyes scanning the space with fresh intent. He wasn't looking for a broken lock anymore. He was looking for a hiding place. A house this large, this modern, was full of them. Attic spaces, crawl spaces, wall cavities for plumbing and wiring. The killer knew this house. He knew it intimately. Ramsey found Simone's tablet on the floor near the couch. Its screen shattered. He handed it to a tech from the forensics unit. "I want everything off this, especially the app for her independent cameras. She saw something last night. I want to see it too." He began his own methodical walkthrough, starting in the master bedroom. It was as chaotic as the living room, a clear sign the struggle had begun there. He noticed the piece of black electrical tape crudely stuck over the air vent on the ceiling. It was a small detail, but it screamed volumes. She was afraid of something in the walls. He continued his search, his movements slow and deliberate. He ran his hands along the walls, knocking gently, listening for hollow spots. He opened every closet, shining his flashlight into the deep recesses. In the back of a hallway linen closet, tucked away behind a stack of towels, he found something. A small, almost empty bag of beef jerky and an empty water bottle. It wasn't Simone's. The brand was cheap, the kind you buy at a gas station. A stark contrast to the organic, artisanal products that filled her pantry. Someone had been snacking in her closet. "We're not looking for an intruder," Ramsey said, holding up the empty bag in an evidence baggie. "We're looking for a resident." His phone buzzed. It was the tech. "Detective, you need to see this. I've recovered the footage from the Wise cam in the hallway, from last night, just before the 911 call." Ramsey walked back to the makeshift command center in the kitchen. The tech had the video queued up on his laptop. He hit play. Ramsey watched the grainy, low-light footage of the empty hallway. And then he saw it. The flicker of movement. The shadow detaching from the wall. A clear human form, just for a second, before it melted back into the darkness. Miller had called it a trick of the light. Ramsey knew better. He was looking at a ghost that had a name, a motive, and, thanks to the victim's own due diligence, a face that could now be hunted. The system had failed Simone Hayes, but Isaiah Ramsey would not. He would find the man who lived in the walls, and he would drag him out into the light. The name came from the last person to offer Simone Hayes a glimmer of hope, Frank, the network technician. When Ramsey's detectives tracked him down, the old wire runner didn't hesitate. "Caleb Mitchell," he said, the name tasting like something foul. Fired from OmniLife for stalking. Kid was a savant with systems, but there was something missing behind the eyes. With a name, the ghost began to take shape. Caleb Mitchell had no criminal record, but his digital footprint was that of a phantom. He had erased himself from social media a year ago. His last known address was a rundown apartment complex in East Atlanta, a world away from the manicured lawns of Buckhead. By the time Ramsey's team kicked in the door, the apartment was cold and empty, but Caleb had left his soul behind. The place wasn't an apartment, it was a shrine. The walls of the single squalid room were plastered with photographs of Simone, hundreds of them, long lens shots of her walking to her car from the hospital, grainy photos of her having coffee with Maya, taken through a cafe window, pictures of her inside her own home, reading on the couch, cooking in the kitchen, taken from somewhere outside, looking in. But the most disturbing were the recent ones. Close-ups. Intimate shots of her sleeping, her face relaxed and vulnerable. These weren't taken through a window. On a rickety desk sat a stack of black spiral-bound notebooks. Ramsey put on a pair of gloves and opened the top one. The page was filled with a tiny, cramped, meticulous script. It was a diary. An obsessive chronological catalog of Simone's life for the past year, from the perspective of her stalker. Ramsey read excerpts aloud to his partner, his voice a low, disgusted monotone. Day 314. She bought the house today. Our house. I knew she would. I made sure the Nexus system I designed was the one the developer chose. A perfect invisible nervous system for our life together. Day 450. The installation. She offered me coffee. She smiled at me. She doesn't know it. But that was our first real connection. She invited me in. Day 680. I can't stand being away from her anymore. While running the final diagnostics, I found it. A perfect space. A technical alcove behind the pantry wall, meant for a future comms panel. Big enough, I soundproofed it last week. I can move in soon. I will be with her always, her protector, her shadow. The diaries were a roadmap to a diseased mind. They detailed his secret life within her walls. He wrote about the food he ate, the things he moved to keep her guessing, the times he would stand over her bed while she slept, close enough to feel the warmth of her breath. He described his terror and fury when she called the police, calling Officer Miller a blind fool who couldn't see the truth right in front of him. And then, the final entry, dated the day of the murder. She saw me, the camera. She brought the fools here again. She wants to throw me out. She wants to end us. I can't let that happen. A body is a temporary thing. A soul is forever. Tonight, we will be together forever. The evidence was damning, a confession written in black ink. But one crucial piece was missing. The diaries told them that Caleb had lived in the house, but the forensics team, despite tearing the place apart, hadn't found where. They had knocked on every wall, searched every closet, and swept the attic. They found the discarded jerky bag Ramsey had spotted, but no entrance, no secret room, no physical proof of his nest. Without the location of the hideout, the core of the crime, a clever defense attorney could argue the diaries were pure fantasy, the ravings of a disturbed mind who had simply broken in that one final night. He built the system, Ramsey said, pacing in the wreckage of Caleb's apartment. He designed the schematics. The hiding place wouldn't be an accident. It would be a feature, not a bug, something he built in from the start. He pulled out the architectural blueprints of the house they had acquired from the county. He and his team spread them across the floor, tracing the lines for plumbing, electrical, and HVAC. They saw the note on the plans for the pantry, future AV and network panel access. It was a small, insignificant box on the diagram. In the real world, the wall was seamless, covered in the same expensive wallpaper as the rest of the kitchen. There was no door, no panel, no visible seam. He built his way in, and then he sealed it from the inside, Ramsey's partner theorized, like a pharaoh in a pyramid. Which means we're not looking for a door, Ramsey replied, his eyes narrowing. We're looking for a wall that shouldn't be there. They had the confession. They had the motive. They had the killer's name. But the ghost's lair remained hidden, and until they found it, Caleb Mitchell was still just a phantom, his guilt as hard to grasp as a shadow on a wall. 2 days after the discovery of Caleb Mitchell's shrine, the investigation had hit a wall, literally. The forensics team had used thermal imagers, stud finders, and even fiber optic cameras drilled through tiny holes in the drywall around the pantry. They found nothing but insulation, studs, and wiring. The theory of the hidden alcove, so vividly described in Caleb's diaries, was beginning to seem like a delusion. Morale was dipping, and the brass was getting impatient. Detective Ramsey, however, was a man who trusted the words of the dead. Simone Hayes' terror had been real. Caleb Mitchell's obsession had been real. The hiding place had to be real. When technology failed, he fell back on something more primal, more instinctual. "Get me K9, he ordered, overriding the objections of the forensics supervisor, who grumbled about contaminating the scene. "I want the best scent dog you've got. We're not looking for drugs or bombs. I need a dog trained for human remains and confined space searches." An hour later, Officer Kendrick arrived with his partner, a magnificent dark-furred Belgian Malinois named Shadow. The dog was a bundle of coiled energy, his intelligence radiating from intelligent, focused eyes. Unlike the lumbering labs used for bomb detection, Malinois were lean, athletic, and possessed a legendary drive. Shadow was the K9 unit superstar, a dog capable of detecting a trace of human scent through feet of concrete. Ramsey met Kendrick outside. "The theory is, our suspect lived inside a hidden space in this house for months," Ramsey explained. "The team can't find the entrance. I'm hoping your guy can. If there's a human scent signature in there, Shadow will find it," Kendrick said with quiet confidence. "He just needs a starting point." They started him with a piece of Caleb's clothing from the apartment, letting the dog get a deep, clean hit of the suspect's scent. Then Kendrick led him inside. "Such," he commanded, the German word for seek. Shadow went to work. He moved through the house with a silent, fluid grace, his nose twitching, deciphering the complex tapestry of scents. He ignored the blood in the living room. That was old, contaminated. He was looking for the specific living scent of Caleb Mitchell. He swept through room after room, occasionally pausing, but moving on. Ramsay watched, his hope beginning to wane. Then Shadow entered the pantry. The change was immediate and dramatic. The dog's tail, which had been relaxed, went rigid. His body tensed. He began to move back and forth, his nose pressed to the floor, then to the wall. He whined softly, a high-pitched sound of intense concentration. He circled the small room, and then he stopped. He stood before the back wall of the pantry, the same blank, seamless wall the forensics team had scanned, drilled, and dismissed. Shadow sniffed at the baseboard, then rose on his hind legs, putting his paws on the wall. He looked back at Kendrick, then back at the wall, and then he began to bark. It wasn't an aggressive bark, it was a frustrated, insistent alert. "It's here! It's right here! Are you blind?" He began to scratch at the wallpaper, his claws tearing at the expensive silk finish. "He's got it," Kendrick said, his voice tight with excitement. Ramsay felt a surge of adrenaline. "Get a sledgehammer and a pry bar," he yelled to an officer standing nearby. The forensics supervisor protested again about protocol, but Ramsay silenced him with a glare. "Your protocols failed. His just succeeded. Take down that wall." The first blow of the sledgehammer echoed through the house like a gunshot. The drywall crumpled. The second blow broke through. And then the smell hit them. It was a foul, overpowering stench of stale air, sweat, human waste, and decay. The officers recoiled, covering their noses. Ramsay pushed forward, shining his high-powered flashlight into the dark hole. It was there, a narrow, coffin-sized space between the pantry wall and the house's main chimney stack. A filthy mattress was crammed inside, along with empty food wrappers, plastic bottles filled with urine, and a small laptop. And at the far end, drilled through the drywall of the chimney stack itself, was a small, dark hole. Ramsay knew instantly where it led. He walked back into the master bedroom, stood by the bed, and looked at the wall behind it. He found the corresponding spot, a place that would give a perfect unobstructed view of the bed. Drilled through the wall and hidden by a slight discoloration in the paint was a tiny hole, no bigger than a dime. It was the lens, the eye of the monster. They had found the ghost nest. The discovery of the hidden alcove blew the case wide open. It was the physical proof that corroborated every insane word in Caleb Mitchell's diaries. He was no longer a phantom. He was a flesh-and-blood monster with a lair, and now the entire Atlanta PD was hunting him. The crucial lead came from the laptop, found in the filth of his nest. Digital forensics analysts bypassed his encryption and unearthed a treasure trove of his final plans. He had become obsessed with a place he and Simone had supposedly connected on a spiritual level, the abandoned Bradley Observatory on the outskirts of the city. His final diary entries were filled with delusional fantasies about this location. "The stars will be our witnesses," he had written. "At the eye that sees the heavens, our souls will finally become one. She will understand then." He had researched the observatory's layout, its security weaknesses, its history. It was his chosen stage for their final act. Ramsay didn't wait for a full SWAT deployment. He knew Caleb was wounded. Defensive scratches from Simone had been deep and likely unstable. Time was of the essence. With just his partner and 2 other detectives, he drove towards the observatory, a relic of the 1950s space race optimism, now a skeletal ruin on a lonely hilltop. They found him in the main dome, beneath the massive silent telescope. Caleb Mitchell was slumped against the control pedestal, pale and shivering, a bloody makeshift bandage wrapped around his forearm, where Simone had slashed him with a shard of glass. He was whispering to a photograph of her, the same one from her mantelpiece, now spattered with her blood. "Caleb Mitchell!" Ramsay's voice boomed, echoing in the cavernous, derelict space. "It's over. Show me your hands." Caleb looked up, his eyes wide and feverish, lost in a world of his own making. "You can't stop it," he rasped, a crazed smile touching his lips. "Love is a constant, like the stars. We're meant to be here." "The only thing you're meant for is a prison cell," Ramsay said, his own gun steady, his voice devoid of emotion. He saw Caleb's hand twitch toward his jacket. "Don't even think about it." But Caleb was too far gone. With a final desperate cry of, "Simone!" he lunged, not at the detectives, but toward a rusted catwalk with a missing railing. Before anyone could react, he threw himself over the edge, plummeting 20 feet to the concrete floor below. The sickening crack of bone and the final exhalation of air was the last sound he ever made. Weeks later, the case was closed. The evidence was overwhelming, the story a grim headline that shocked the city for a week before fading into the next news cycle. Officer Miller was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation that would likely end with a quiet resignation. Justice, in its clumsy bureaucratic way, had been served. But for Detective Isaiah Ramsey, the case never truly closed. One evening, he found himself driving down Peachtree, pulling his car to a stop across the street from Simone Hayes' house. The police tape was gone, but the house looked vacant, haunted. A "for sale" sign was already staked into the immaculate lawn. He thought about the series of failures that had led to her death, the dismissal of her fears by a system that was supposed to protect her, the insidious nature of a society that so often mistakes a woman's intuition for hysteria, the terrifying new frontier of technology where the very conveniences designed to make us feel safe can be twisted into instruments of terror, building cages with invisible bars. The greatest lesson, he mused, was the most chilling one. The monster hadn't needed to kick down a door or shatter a window. He had been invited in with a smile and a cup of coffee. He had hidden in plain sight, cloaked not by darkness, but by the privilege of his expertise and the blindness of others' prejudice. The true horror wasn't the ghost in the machine. It was the realization that, in our modern world, we hand over the keys to our lives every single day, to the cloud, to our devices, to the strangers who build our homes and networks. Ramsey put the car in drive and pulled away, leaving the silent house behind. The real takeaway from the tragedy of Simone Hayes was a piece of advice as old as humanity itself, a lesson now written in blood and underscored by technological dread. Always trust your fear. It is the oldest, most intuitive security system you will ever own, and sometimes it's the only one that works.